Good evening, everyone. My name is Sean Shetler, and I'm a graduate student at Houston Christian University. And today I'm presenting my final exegetical PowerPoint for Exegesis Component 5. It's for class CHRI 5305 B02, Theological Inquiry with Dr. Robert Bugg. This presentation will focus on a comparative analysis of Luke 11:33 through 36. Most translations include verse 33. The lamp of the body, and Matthew 6:22 through 23, Sermon on the Mount, and the heading Treasures in Heaven. These two biblical passages that share common themes yet exhibit distinct details. To guide our discussion, we'll explore 5 key questions. How does Luke's version of the saying relate to Matthew's version? What historical background is essential for understanding the saying? What would Jesus' audience have understood this teaching differently compared to Luke's audience? What was the original meaning of Jesus' statement within its first century context? And 5, how can modern believers apply this teaching in today's world, given the differences between ancient and contemporary contexts? Throughout this presentation, we will examine the biblical text carefully, considering the literary and historical contexts, and seek to uncover their theological significance. Introduction. Comparison of Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36. Introduction to the study. Before we begin our study in exegesis, we'll read 2 key texts. Matthew 6:22 through 23 of the NRSV. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is this darkness? Luke 11:33 through 36, NRSV. No one after lighting a lamp puts it in a cellar, but on the lampstand, so that those who enter may see the light. Your eye is the lamp of your body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. But if it is unhealthy, your body is full of darkness. Therefore consider whether the light in you is not darkness. If then your whole body is full of light, with no part of it in darkness, it will be as full of light as when a lamp gives you light with its rays. Key points to consider before our study. Jesus uses the eye as a metaphor for spiritual perception. A healthy eye represents clarity, generosity, and alignment with God's truth. A bad, evil eye symbolizes greed, selfishness, and spiritual blindness. These passages challenge us to examine our inner vision, how we perceive truth, wealth, and righteousness. And Luke's version expands on the metaphor by connecting it to shining light for others. Point 1 of comparison of Matthew 6:22 and 23 versus Luke 11:33 through 36. In this slide, we'll highlight the key takeaway from our comparison. Both passages emphasize the idea of one's inner perception determines spiritual condition, but they are framed differently by Matthew and Luke. Matthew presents this teaching as a call to undivided devotion, urging believers to prioritize God over material wealth. Luke frames it as a prophetic warning, cautioning against spiritual blindness and the rejection of divine truth. This distinction reflects how oral traditions of Jesus' teachings were adapted by different gospel writers to fit their theological and narrative purposes. And to better understand these differences, we analyze these passages through 3 critical approaches. Form criticism examines the oral tradition and genre. Matthew treats this as a wisdom saying or on devotion to God. And Luke presents it as both a wisdom teaching and a prophetic warning against rejecting Jesus. Literary criticism looks at structure and context. In Matthew, this passage is part of Jesus' ethical teachings on wealth and priorities in the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it is placed in a warning about rejecting Jesus' light and reinforcing the urgency of spiritual awareness. Grammatical criticism analyzes word meanings and syntax. Matthew uses the Greek word haplos, meaning single or undivided, emphasizing focus and devotion. And Luke uses kalos for good and paneros for evil, creating a strong moral contrast between embracing or rejecting life. These differences demonstrate how each gospel writer shaped Jesus' teachings to address their specific audiences and theological themes. Point 2 of comparison of Luke 11:33 through 36 versus Matthew 6:22 through 23. Reader response criticism. Matthew's audience likely interprets the passage as a moral exhortation, emphasizing wealth, material distractions, and spiritual focus. Luke's audience may see it as a call to spiritual awareness, highlighting the necessity of accepting Christ as the true life. Traditional criticism. Matthew's version aligns with Jewish wisdom literature, particularly ethical teachings on devotion to God versus material wealth. Luke's version carries apocalyptic and prophetic overtones, warning against spiritual blindness and rejection of Jesus' revelation. Redaction criticism. Matthew integrates this teaching into the Sermon on the Mount, reinforcing this theme of ethical righteousness and wholehearted devotion to God. And Luke places it within a different narrative context, connecting it to Jesus' broader warning about rejecting divine truth. His expansion in verse 36 underscores the metaphor of being completely full of light. Comparison point number 3. Luke 11:33 through 36 versus Matthew 6:22 and 23. Key takeaways. Theological interpretation. Matthew emphasizes personal holiness and moral clarity, teaching that a healthy eye reflects devotion to God, while a bad eye represents spiritual corruption and greed. Luke focuses on spiritual openness to divine revelation, warning that those who reject Christ remain in darkness, while those who accept him are spiritually illuminated. Canonical criticism. Both passages use the imagery of light and darkness, but Matthew connects it to righteous living. See Proverbs 4:18 through 19 and Matthew 5:14 through 16, and warns against materialism, as seen in Matthew 6:24. Luke aligns with themes of Jesus as the divine light, as seen in John 1:5 and John 8:12. And this echoes Isaiah 42 verses 6 through 7, where God's servant brings light to the nations. Historical criticism. In Matthew's Jewish context, the evil eye was a common idiom for greed, envy, or selfishness. See Proverbs 28 verse 22 and Deuteronomy 15:9, reinforcing Jesus' warning against materialism. Luke's Greco-Roman audience would have understood the lamp on a stand metaphor as a wisdom and knowledge symbol, linking spiritual blindness to rejecting divine truth. Comparison point number 4. Luke 11:33 through 36 versus Matthew 6:22 through 23. Key takeaways. Structuralism. Both passages use binary oppositions, light versus darkness. Matthew emphasizes an ethical contrast, greed versus devotion, and Luke presents a theological contrast, accepting versus rejecting Christ's revelation. Luke expands the metaphor with the lamp to stress illumination through faith in Christ. In the ancient Near Eastern, the evil eye was a well-known concept in Jewish and ancient Near Eastern cultures. In Jewish tradition, it represented greed, envy, and selfishness. Light versus darkness was a central theme in apocalyptic literature and mystery religions. Luke's metaphor of letting in the light may have resonated with both Jewish and Greco-Roman audiences familiar with illumination motifs.